Hi, my name is Jay Reed. I'm a psychotherapist in San Francisco, California, and today I'd like to continue the series on shame and recovery from narcissistic abuse and address the topic of how shame can show up in our daily lives. So shame is a very painful emotion which can be brought on when stuck in relationship to someone who is narcissistic. One of the reasons is that the narcissist is so self-absorbed that they're unable and or unwilling to offer much connection or attunement to the other person, so that there's sort of this frequent and often intense break in the connection between the individual and the narcissistic person. Because this person is often experienced as sort of an object for the gratification of the narcissist, or worse, the kind of repository for the narcissist unwanted feelings of worthlessness and or their own shame. And regardless of kind of the form it takes, the experience is often in this position of going unseen, unknown, and certainly not understood. And certainly it can get worse, but that's sort of a ground floor for what being in relationship to a narcissistic individual can feel like. But when that break occurs and one is sort of inhabiting this position, as discussed in last week's video, that's what often sort of begets the experience of shame. Coming with that, the desire to hide, the desire to disappear, all in an effort to endure this state and the helplessness of sort of feeling in disconnection and estranged from sort of others here and being helpless to restore it. Shame works very effectively to make that experience more survivable, yet is still very painful as an emotion itself. And if the other person in relationship to the narcissist has no or very few other outlets where this type of mutual connection is possible to sort of counteract, this continual experience with the narcissistic person, then that person has to figure out a solution to escape the agony of these feelings of shame, and they must figure out the solution kind of all on their own. These solutions are much needed and I think admirable in the resourcefulness of the survivor of narcissistic abuse that is reflected in the adoption of these solutions. And this kind of comes from the research too, that the solutions can, broadly speaking, come in two forms. One is to attack the other rather than to sort of continue to sort of attend to the shame and how it feels and maybe even festers. The other is to attack the self. And this sort of takes the kind of state of being in disconnect and feeling so helpless and estranged to sort of a more concretized version of like what is wrong. And this is where feelings of defectiveness, undeservedness can really come in, even reasons as to why one is defective and or undeserving. So it's sort of still getting one away from the kind of base and core sense of the shame or felt experience of the shame and taking the action of going on the attack even towards oneself. Going back to the origin of shame, that break in the relationship, going on an attack or finding an other or object to attack, even if it's the self, can helpfully shift one's attention from what feels unbearable to something more survivable, launching and carrying forth with an attack, towards the other or towards the self. So attacking the other, let's start with that solution to shame. That actually may be familiar to those who've watched some of these videos in terms of who employs this solution more often. And it can involve the process of relocating an unbearable state into another person, often whom one has authority over and or whom that other person is dependent upon. And this can involve acting in ways so that the other seems and even grows to feel deserving of feeling shame so that the other person doesn't. There's an implicit sense that they get to actually control the shame as it's experienced in the other, and sort of that in that manner functions as a way to sort of expunge it from the self. And often the dominant emotion when one goes on the attack to the other that is felt is that of contempt for the person they've relocated the shame to. And I think it's worth just defining what contempt is. There's a very prominent researcher on emotions named Paul Ekman, and he actually includes contempt as one of the 7 basic universal emotions that we feel. And he defines it as the feeling of dislike or superiority, usually morally, over another person, group of people, and or their actions. So there's this sort of boost in one's own sense of self and a devaluation of the other upon whom the shame is being offloaded to. And suffice it to say that the narcissistic parent or partner will often employ this strategy to cope with their shame, at the expense, of course, of the self-worth available to their children and or partners. In contrast, I think that the most common way of dealing with shame for survivors of narcissistic abuse is the second solution of attacking the self. I think that the attack on the self actually is also captured in the earlier videos on beliefs often held by the scapegoated child of a narcissistic parent. For instance, the belief that I am defective, I am physically disgusting, I do not deserve protection. These beliefs, I think, all kind of at their core reflect the solution of coping with the shame felt by being disconnected from in this manner, where connection was expected and or hoped for, with this attack on the self that shame so often sort of begets and facilitates. Importantly, for the victim of narcissistic abuse, attacking the self as a solution to the shame can effectively stave off the person's own anger. And that's really essential to surviving, particularly in the scapegoated role, where if the scapegoat were to try to interrupt the narcissist's attempt to relocate that narcissist's own worthlessness into the scapegoated child, then the intensity of the attacks on that scapegoated child, I believe, would only increase in intensity and frequency, and may even, in the worst cases, not be survivable. So again, it's just so extremely adaptive and deserving of respect that I believe that the scapegoated child has found such ingenious, though painful, ways to stave off their own anger. It just doesn't serve a good purpose in the moment and situation that a scapegoated child faces to get angry with a narcissist, in my strong opinion at least. And the emotion that can pervade the person experiencing the shame-based attack on self is disgust. And Paul Ekman again defines disgust as a feeling of aversion towards something offensive. And it can contain a range of states with varying intensities from mild dislike to intense loathing. And I think often folks who've been scapegoated know sort of that severe end of the continuum of intense self-loathing that again is adaptive in that situation. Painful, searingly painful as it is. In these moments where the attack on the self is especially severe, there can be a sense of sort of recoiling from oneself, wanting to kind of do two things. Sort of, I think of it as sort of a split, where one part of the self regards sort of the other part of the self as the disgusting part, right? There's one part within saying, you're worthy of disgust because of how you look, the sort of stupid thing one said or did. But there is this other part sort of casting the judgment. So it's sort of this split. And then there's also this experience often of a freeze. That is sort of, again, the action tendency that shame will often facilitate, to sort of get into a very static, frozen pose, because that can make this experience of the disconnect feel more, again, survivable. It sort of lets time pass when the next moment does not feel endurable by being in that freeze state. And I think that freeze state can manifest in a variety of ways sort of during the course of the attack on the self. I'll just name a few that I've sort of noticed. One can be tensing of the trapezius muscles here, of one or the other, sort of subtly. These often happen in a sort of autonomic way. We don't kind of elect to do this kind of tensing. It just happens. Alternately, or even in conjunction, can be a tensing in the middle torso area, upper abdomen, lower abdomen, tensing of a tricep, one or both, curling one's toes inward, and in a way too, kind of focusing one's attention and awareness only to sort of the contents of one's mind, kind of tensing up. And I think about all these ways of tensing and holding the tension as kind of like a snail in a nautilus shell. The snail or crab will kind of get in, and maybe for humans, like in a fetal position, where it's sort of the ultimate protective maneuver when no other options are available. And again, one to be respected and worked with also. These solutions to shame keep someone safe when trapped in the sort of proverbial cage with the narcissistic tiger. Then there's no escape, but there is a hope to endure and survive. And I'd like to sort of address how this solution can also kind of manifest in a different way in one's life. When experiencing this shame-based attack on the self, the person suffering this may experience and welcome any form of relief that's offered. And one way that this relief can sometimes be found can come in the form of paying more attention to others and the others' experience than one's own experience. Doing so allows the person to invest with totality into the fortunes of the other and feel very sort of grateful for the distraction that this investment serves in taking their attention away from their own shame internally and what can often be disgust-filled inner world. That to kind of go inward can feel like it's sort of just entering this black hole of self-loathing and very, very painful experience that doesn't seem to have an end. And so redirecting one's attention to something outside the self can be very, very, again, adaptive and needed in certain points. And I think that the takeaway, I hope, from this mention of this type of survival, focusing attention on others, is to highlight the cruelty of the predicament that the scapegoated child finds him or herself in, not to sort of say that there's anything wrong with the person in the scapegoated role for employing this solution. Again, I think it's to their credit that they found a way to offer themselves some relief and way to get through this battle in order to eventually win the war. And I think it also highlights why healing this kind of inner experience of shame when going through prolonged narcissistic abuse can be a very incremental process, but again, well worth it and well deserved for the survivor. And you can imagine how this strategy of paying more attention externally than internally would be very adaptive in relationship to someone who's narcissistic. The narcissist will often find that kind of attention both to be expected because they have this sort of overly inflated sense of their own importance and sense of entitlement to the other's attention as such. And conforming with the narcissist expectations in this way can minimize the damage suffered for as long as that is needed to be done. Well, thanks for watching today's video on the two ways that shame can be coped with in terms of attacking others, which is often done by the person who's narcissistic, or attacking the self, which is often the needed strategy for the person in relationship to the narcissist. In next week's video, we're going to talk about specific strategies for recovering from shame, dealing with it, living alongside it in a psychological way, a somatic, bodily-based way, and in an emotional way. I'd like to offer some tactics that can be used in those three dimensions to help combat the more destructive experiences of sort of prolonged bouts of shame and the corresponding attacks on the self. Well, as always, thank you for your continued engagement with the channel and support to one another. It's really great to see. And I wish everyone well and look forward to posting again next Sunday at 9 a.m. Pacific time.